OpenFest 2024. Back to the source.
Please welcome Monty Widenius.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So I'm happy to be here in Sofia again. That was about 7 years since I had a talk here last time. But before starting with my talk, I just want to have a small announcement, is that last Sunday we did celebrate 15 years since the first MariaDB release, and we are still going strong, so I'm happy about that. So let's see how I can get this to work. Okay. So this is basically about how to make money with open source. But to be able to do that, you first also need to know how to create a successful open source project. So this talk is basically in 2 stages, quickly going through all the steps that you need to know to create a project, and then how to make money on it. So I will assume that you are all here because you want to make money on open source at some point. That would make you entrepreneurs, and I'm an entrepreneur by heart, so I'm happy to see so many people. Much more on that side than that side. I don't know why. But anyway, so there's lots of reasons to use open source and develop open source. Personally, I believe that developing open source is a better way to do software, because you are not constrained by your own ideas. If you're successful, you get input everywhere. But these are the things that when you are pitching about open source, trying to convince people to use open source, they need to know that there is lots of reasons for users to use open source. And I believe that the most important one for enterprises is no vendor lock-in. In other words, nobody can come and say that next month you have to pay more for the software. If the software is stopped developing, you can take it over, or you can find other people to do that, or pay somebody to do that. You are the one who is in charge, not then some entrepreneur or entity that you can't 100% rely on that will exist for the next 20, 50 years. So it's good to be part of an open source project. If you're successful, you get more developers, some of that you hire, others who will contribute to your project. And in most cases, you get better code because you have more people looking at the code and criticizing it. But it's very hard to create a profitable company around an open source project, because it's open source, people can use it for free, so why should they pay? And that also makes it really hard to go to an investor and saying that I would like to do this open source project, or I already have it, and no, I would like to have an investment. Because the investor wants to be sure that he can get the money back, and if you have no way to get any money back, you will not get the money for the investor. Or at least it's very hard. So this is a quote from Bruno, who was having an Apache license, and he was trying to get companies to pay for it, and nobody basically paid. And he just concluded that you can't make money on Apache license. At least not enough money to compete with closed source projects. So he changed his license to AGPL. Some big companies complained, and then they started to pay him. But little back to open source project. There's lots of reasons to create a project. I created MySQL, actually the predecessor of MySQL, originally because I had a customer who had a problem. So, and that's then eventually over several different customers and problem solving, it's then become MySQL. But I've always been customer focused and created those. And the other company ways to get project is that as long as when you work at a company, if you ensure that you have the copyright, or at least the shared copyright of the code, you can work at any company and create a project that you then at some point can go out from the company and then use. And of course, the other reason is that you want to be able to work, earn money and work. And some of us also want to bring something back to the community. What I love with what I did with MySQL and MariaDB is that we come up with a license model that enabled most people to use it for free, but a certain segment had to pay. And that allowed us to grow to some 400 people until we then eventually was sold at Sun. So I usually try to describe to investors why open source works. Because as a user, you use open source because it's free. Or even if you pay for support, it's very inexpensive. And at some point, when you have used the code for some time, you maybe want to do some additions, something is missing, or you have somebody else who you know who would need something. So you extend the code for your own or your friend's benefit, and but you don't want to maintain it. So you give it back to the community, because for each new release, you would have to do all the changes again, so it's easier to participate. So this kind of creates a natural way why open source works, and also explains to investors that why somebody wants to be part of open source. It's because we are selfish human beings, most of us, and by helping ourselves, it's beneficial for us to be participating in open source, because we have to do less. And that's actually something that investors understand. So before starting an open source project, always check that something exists similar that you can participate in. Because it's always better to use something that already exists, because you can learn from their mistakes and be part of their success. And there's lots of dead projects. If you see that in the space that you want to be, dead projects, either there were no business there or they did wrong. And the best way to finance your project without having to go to investors, because if you go early to investors, they will say that, okay, you have a good idea, I'll give you some money and I will own 60% of your project. And with what we created with MySQL, really didn't want to do that. We basically waited until we didn't need investors. Then we took them, because then we could get investors on our turn. So you need to wait. But initially, the easiest way to start, find something inside the company you are working or external company, and you can say, I can solve this for you. And you then work under normal salary, but you keep the copyright, so you can use that as a base. That's what I did. I always had a copyright for everything I wrote. And when creating a project, it's not about the source code. One of the most common misunderstanding from engineers is that the better code wins. That's not the case. It's the one with the better community who wins, and eventually you will get the better code. So you need to create a community from start. And to create that, you have to interact, make it easy for the community to be part of your project. And you also need to make that the binaries is available. And you really want to get into distributions like SUSE, Ubuntu, and so on. But for that, you have to do a lot of things right. And of course, you need to have a good team, but you also need to have somebody to work with the community. Just releasing the source on GitHub and not talking at conferences, not convincing people, not having a forum, you will never succeed. And you need to have somebody or a group who is seen as the leader of the project, so you can ensure that the code is evolving in the way that is beneficial for the project and just not for one contributor. And I believe that putting some of your best developers to work with the community is actually the best way to create an active community. Lots of companies just put some support engineers work with the community, but that also means that he can't answer all the questions that the community has. And in open source, how you convince people to use your software is also not only the code, it also what do they believe about you, what's your future, how will you earn money, because most people want to ensure that the project will exist, and also what will happen with the license, will there be license changes? People hate that, that's why you have forks. So by being very transparent of what you do, how you are going to do that, how you plan to earn money, who can contribute, where you're going to go, and be open about the bugs you have, because it's better that you document them than your users just happens to stumble over them. And communication is key. As long as you are transparent, you talk about, let people know what you're planning to do, then you have a really good chance to be successful. This is basically what I did with MySQL, have been doing with MariaDB, and with MariaDB we have been even more active with the community and try to make it really easy for anybody to contribute. And one thing to understand is that, the last sentence, don't expect the community to produce any code. There's lots of people who have had the impression, I release something and then other people will join. Nobody will join your project if they don't have a need for it or they're not using it. So it's first after they have used your code for some time and then notice, I need these changes. And they start to do that for their own good and then they participate by giving it to you. That's when you get that. So that can take 1 or 2 years after the first release. So don't be surprised or unhappy if nobody's contributing. You need to find the users who actually want to use you and need to use you. Then you get contributors. And you need to be prepared to work with the community and share the fame. If somebody's doing something great, you need to show that, to get him activated, get it to do even more. So you need to also to be fast to provide feedbacks, and you need to help others. So to do things better with MariaDB than what we did with MySQL, I created a MariaDB Foundation, where we have people who are paid for helping the community get their patches in. If somebody wants to do something in MariaDB, they can contact the foundation and they will tell you how to do it, what's the architecture for the thing what you want to do. We make it really easy. And don't talk bad about competing projects, because nobody wants to have flame wars on the forum or the email list or Slack or however you communicate with your people. I always spent a lot of time pushing down people who were started to fight between each other. You don't want to have that in your community. And you have to start early with the community. If you already have a ready project, but you spent 1 or 2 years doing that, and the competitors did something similar and created a community, you are late. You want to have the community who needs what you are going to do to participate in your project and not in some other project. So getting them on board early is key. And then the mantra in open source: release early, release often. Don't wait until it's perfect. Release it when you want to have feedback to show what you're doing. So that's what we're doing with MariaDB Vector, and we have a talk about that today. We have something that works really, really good. It's still not perfect. We still have things to do, but we wanted to show the community that in the vector space, in open source databases, we are one of the best ones. And you want to show that early. And you would want to have testing from users early. And you also have to make it easy to get and use your product. So when I started with MySQL 96, it was not common that people had binaries, and most things were released in source. So we was one of the first one who did binaries for lots of different platforms and did tests. Even today, we are doing tests on some 50 different configurations, compilers, operating system for every release, just to be able to ensure that MariaDB is stable and works everywhere. And one slide about just that. Most modern things that I see that is happening, even AI, very soon there'll be something compatible or who can compete with it in open source. Apple wouldn't exist without open source. The whole Mac OS is built on our open source foundation. So open source is the right thing for the future, but we still have a long time to go to have most things open source, because even if the desktop is getting better, your phones are still mostly closed source software. So we still have something we can improve. But that also means that there is lots of opportunities for open source developers, just because when an enterprise is looking for a solution, if they find a good open source solution, they will use that, prefer to use that before a closed source one. So now we come into the money talk that you all have been waiting on. When talking with some open source well-known advocates, it's really hard to talk to them about money, because they think that everything should be free, everything should be available. In that case, you can't really create a company who can compete with the big guys like Microsoft or Google. And just because it's open source, there's no guarantee that you actually will make enough money. And there are very few companies who have done an IPO based on open source. Red Hat did one, but Red Hat is not an open source development company. It's a distribution company. And so SourceFire, Hortonworks, and MariaDB is basically the only one. So there are different kinds of open source products. Those are developed by company or community, products that are developed by few developers, and all of those has different ways to earn money. So this is probably the most important slide of all. So you have basically two kinds of companies. A service company who basically lives by support and helps users. You can create a service company around MariaDB or Postgres and serve something. But your valuation will be 2 times your revenue. So if you earn 1 million a year, your company will be worth 2 million. Not bad, but if you have a software company and you make 1 million, you will earn 10 million. Or in some extreme cases, like with Tesla, 30 or 40 times if you're just looking at the software. So you want to be a software company. But of course, because we're using open source, that's hard to be. But there are some ways to so that you can get your multiple higher. So looking at MySQL, we earned about 70 million a year. We were open source, but we had found a way to get some people to pay. So we come into this 10x time. So 70 million, that's 700 million. And because we had some 50 million users, that get us up to a valuation of 1 billion. That's what Sun paid for us. So this arithmetic works perfectly for MySQL too. But one thing that you also have to think about is, what's the end game with your company? Do you want to be on the stock market? Do you want to be bought by another company? Or do you want to have something that will continue forever and you have with some founders and earn money? Or you would want to create an open source foundation who will do things for the good of it. And all of those has different needs and different license that you have to consider. And most personally, I was always interested in the first part, but still in a way so that MySQL or MariaDB would always survive, because that was much more important than the money. I wanted to create something. I wanted, of course, earn money so I could pay my developers and also have a good life, but I really wanted to have lots of users who didn't have to pay anything and actually could do successful business by themselves and create a better environment and not be locked in by the commercial closed source vendors who are only thinking about themselves and never giving anything back. So why to go open source? You want to have more users. Users is the key to get the company or the product spread. You also want to have more testers, because testing software is hard. If you have millions of users and you release something, you will get in a day or two, you will get feedback, this didn't work, so you can fix it. And in MariaDB, when we do a release, if we do something wrong, for example, let's say a PHP connector wouldn't work, we basically, while we are sending out the distribution to the mirrors, we get complaints that this didn't work. So it works really good for very well-known, well-used software. And I did mention this before, but this is really important, is that you also get things done in ways that you didn't expect. So usually you have an idea that the product should go there. Here's what we want to do. We want to focus on cloud. We want to do mirroring or things. And then somebody else has other ideas. And if they participate, your product can suddenly do much more than you ever could have dreamed of. That happened with MySQL and MariaDB. We have penetrated so many different sectors that we never anticipated. So this is actually really important for the licensing part. No vendor lock-in is the key. That when I go and talk with banks, big enterprises who are using closed source databases, every single one tells me that the next database we will use has to be open source. That's the argument. And because they don't want to have a vendor lock-in, because all the reasons that I listed here, if the vendor just stops developing the software. And they also really don't have some hidden trapdoors that people could use to get into the system. With closed source, you never know. That's why China nowadays demands that all external software from outside of China, you have to provide the code to the government if it's not open source, so they can check that there is no trapdoors. They don't trust anyone. And the benefits for using open source. You get easy access to the code. You can look at it. You can fix it. You can enhance it. You can participate. You have lots of freedom, and the freedoms are important for anybody who uses open source. So what we need is basically licenses that will restrict this freedom as little as possible. So the question is also when to go open source. With MySQL, that was based basically on software that had been developed for 20 years. And we decided to go open source with it a couple of months after we did the first releases, just because we decided that we can probably work full-time on this one if we release it. We will not make less money than before, but we also used a license that would enable us that if we would be very successful, which we didn't anticipate, we still would have some way to get customers. So you need to see that, can I work on this full-time? You can never be successful with the open source project if you only work on that part-time. So you need either a project to generate enough money, or you have somebody who he needs that and is paying for your time. And so it's hard to choose a license. I assume that most of you will know the different licenses. There are some hundreds of open source licenses, but in practice, these are the only ones that you need to know about, because you shouldn't use anything else. If you want to be totally free, like SQLite, then you can do public domain. Otherwise, you can use something more restrictive. So the public domain is the most free one, and AGPL is the one that has most restrictions. And restrictions for an entrepreneur is a good thing, because there's always somebody who can't live with those restrictions, and they are prepared to pay you to get rid of those for a copy of the software. So here's basically all models I have seen with open source. Open core model is the most popular one. Personally, I don't like it. I will come up with describe a better model later. Dual licensing that we use for MySQL, service subscription, donations. I have different slides for each of these. So open core just means that you have two versions of the software. One that is for the community, something reasonably good, but still missing things that most enterprises would need. So that to force enterprises to buy that part. But the mistake, or they do, not a mistake, they do this intentionally. They basically are saying that we are an open source company, you can get this for free. But they still expect everybody to go to this closed source part. So they're basically trying to hook you with something that you really don't want to do if you want to have an open source solution. But of course, this is a good business model. If this works for you, then it's fine. But you just be careful what you make closed source or not. Why I don't like this one is that if I'm using an open core model or open core software, I'm using these extra pieces, and the company goes out of business. I have to change to use something else. So that's why I don't like open core. There has to be a better model. You can also try donation and crowdfunding. Crowdfunding can work good for a software that you just do and it's finished and you don't have to touch it anymore. But something that has to have a big user base, you have to do releases, it changes over the years. You can never do that with donation and crowdfunding, because you can maybe get some 100,000, in the best case, 1 million with crowdfunding. For doing something like MySQL or MariaDB, you need 20 million a year just for the engineering part. You can't get that with donation and crowdfunding. So dual licensing, what we used in MySQL, we were the second project who used dual licensing. GoScript that you have in the printers was the first one. And we were the first who used it with GPL. We had the first version that was not GPL based, basically said that here's the code, use it, but if you make money on it, you should talk with us and give us a little bit money so we also can survive. And then with GPL, we come up with the idea is that if our code is GPL, because GPL requires other people who link with you also distribute your code with GPL. And so that's kind of what some people call that GPL is viral. But the benefit, what we come up with, and we were the first who did that, was that there's lots of companies who don't want to have GPL. And because we owned all the copyright, we could release things as GPL, fully open source, with companies like Adobe who wanted to include MySQL inside Adobe, paid for exactly the same code, and we make money of that. About half the money we earned in MySQL over time come from licensing. And the only change we did with the code, we basically went through all the header files, had a program that said that this code is not GPL, it's licensed to Adobe, and they can use it as they want in these products. So it's not more complex than that. But the problem with GPL is only works with products that you link with. So for example, a game on an app store, there's no reason to have that as GPL because nobody would link to it. Maybe you can make a graphic engine because people link with it. That actually would work. So basically for infrastructure, projects, or libraries, GPL is the perfect license, and I really recommend you to do that. But there's lots of other projects that you don't link with. So me and David Axmark, the other founder of MySQL, we come up with a business source license, which basically delayed open source. So the idea is that the source code is available, but it's not open source. You can still use it in some context, and in the license you describe that says that this case is free, and in these few cases you have to pay. For example, if you run this as a SaaS service in the cloud, then you need to have a license. And but after X years, usually 3 or 4, everything becomes open source license. You can choose yourself BSD or GPL. So this is what I would like people to use instead of open core, because if the company who uses BSL goes bust, the code is still there. You maybe have to pay a license to somebody for a year or 2, but after that it's free. So the whole idea with BSL is to allow entrepreneurs to create a business, get investors, but still be able to, in the long term, contribute more to open source. And investors like this because you have a user base who have to pay, and that's up to you to decide. For example, we use this with MaxScale, and we say that if you have a MySQL or MariaDB server, MaxScale is a proxy, and you have 2 servers connected to MaxScale. That's free, but if you need more, then you need a license. But after 3 years, it becomes GPL, and we just released a couple of months ago the first MaxScale GPL version that is 3 years old. So we are kind of following this ourselves. So regarding BSL, if you look at what was the reason that a company trusts an open source vendors. So with business source, you don't have lock-in. You have to pay a license, but the source code is open. You can freely develop on it. You can have other people give support for it. And you can do bug fixes. You can do everything you can do with open source, except that for a small time period, you have to pay some license fee. So it's not open source, but it's better than open core. And to succeed with the BSL license, you have to do something, because you can't just do one code drop and then after 3 years becomes open source, because then there's no reason to buy your newest version. So you have to basically innovate, add more features so that people want to upgrade to the latest version instead of waiting for things to become open source. And it also ensures that no bad actor will buy your company and then make it closed source. They can do that, but still the community can use everything that is released up to now, because it eventually becomes open source. So this gives you, as a user, a reason to trust the company. So here are some recommendations. I think that the second point is the most important one. For a BSL product to work, you have to have lots of users, because you want to spread, you want to have recommendations. So you should target the license so that only small portions, maybe 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, has to pay. The more free users you have, the more popular your product will become, and the more paying user you eventually will get. And you have to support the free version for 5 years, because you want to have the free version into distributions. So, because that's how you make it popular. So we are just working now with lots of Linux distributions to get MaxScale into it, so that people can start using it for free. Still, probably the best proxy for MySQL or MariaDB that exists. Here's some background about business source license. Bruce Perens, who is one of the persons behind the open source license, he has endorsed it, say that, of course, open source is better, but if you want to have a hybrid when GPL doesn't work, then business source license is the best one, because it will ensure that they will become more open source projects over time, which is the goal of this license. We use it for MaxScale proxy MariaDB. You have Hadoop, Cockroach, HashiCorp is using it. I will have another slide about HashiCorp later. So here are some of the questions I usually get about open source licenses. So what happens if a company doesn't pay? The thing is that real serious big companies, they can't afford not to pay, because if they are found out that they have broken the license, the consequences is so big. So if you have a reasonable price for your product, there's no reason they will break them. There are always some people who will not pay, but they wouldn't have paid anyway. So some other open source licenses. You have the common clause. It's a little bit like the BSL, but the problem is that it's more that source is available, but if the company who is using this one goes bust, you can't use the project anymore. And basically how a common clause license would look like is basically license and the conditions under which you can use the license. There are lots of other open source available licenses, but everybody has the same problem. There is no guarantee that there will be more open source projects in the future. That's what I wanted to solve with the BSL. And you have the Mongo SSP license, but it's open source available, but in practice you can't use that in production. So it's nice to have the code, but if you can't use it without paying, then things goes wrong. So, what about open source license where people have adopted in the wrong way? So, I'm working at MariaDB PLC Corporation, and we had some people in charge who basically destroyed the MaxScale BSL license by adding conditions that was never supposed to be there. For example, that if we did a bug fix, we basically reset the date back to 5 years from the bug fix, where the whole idea with the BSL license is that when you first publish the code, the date is fixed there, and even if you do bug fix, it is not changed. And that's what we do now. So we are going now with MaxScale. Latest MaxScale, we are following the BSL license in detail, and MaxScale 6.0 is now soon available in your favorite operating system distribution. So HashiCorp was using BSL. So, and then they went to a more strict one. But what they did wrong was that they basically said that they will not support the old ones and provide bug fixes or security. And that led to that there's it's OpenTofu, I think it's called, fork of HashiCorp, because people didn't like that they went back on their promises how they would work with the community. And that's the biggest problems with open source companies who get investors who force them to earn more money and have to do license changes that the community doesn't like, and that creates forks. So you should try to avoid that. Take a license and stick to it. And anybody follow this thing with Red Hat? Red Hat basically did not a license change, but the change in the subscriptions that you can't redistribute Red Hat, even if they are used GPL software. I think this is wrong. I think they're going against the spirit of the GPL and probably also the legal part. So I'm waiting how this will work out. So the importance of selling licenses. MySQL would never existed if we wouldn't have a license revenue by dual licensing. It's really hard to get companies to pay for support on sponsors and development and get patches. So you need some kind of income that is guaranteed. Subscriptions are okay, but they're really, really hard to sell. License is free money do you get for work already done, and you can get over and over again. There's nothing that can beat it. You want to have that in some form. BSL or dual license provides that to you. So what did make MySQL successful? Okay, we were in a lucky state of time. The internet was new, everybody needed a database, and we did the one thing that nobody believed was possible. We come up with a way to earn money on open source. And that allowed us to spread in a way that the big competitors never expected. We were also very friendly with users, and I personally wrote 30,000 emails during the first 5 years, just helping people, not to get money, but just get them to use MySQL, spread MySQL, and help them. And we waited with investments until the product was good enough. Basically, when we didn't need the money and the investors was calling you at least once a week and said, hey, you have a great product, we would want to give you money. That's the time to take the investors, not earlier, if you can. And I think I'm just on time. Okay. It's lunch now, so I assume we can take questions.
Excuse me?
Is it at lunch now?
Huh?
Is it lunch now?
Yeah, it's lunch after this lecture.
So that means that we can take questions if somebody...
Yeah, the Q&A section is right now.
Okay, perfect.
So thank you very much for your presentation of open source. And we'll start the Q&A section for the next 5 minutes. If anyone has any questions, the microphone is in the center of the hall.
Hello, thank you for your talk. So my question is regarding the EU in general and focusing on open source funding. Do you think that this will be sufficient for the coming years if they actually supplied funding to open source projects and allow people to actually apply for open source funding?
You talked about the governments, did I
Yeah,
get?
yeah.
So we have had in Finland, we have had since 10 years back that the government has to first look at an open source solution before looking at a commercial one. The problem is that it doesn't really work because the people who are doing the project and putting up the requirements are working with the closed source vendors who put requirements that the open source doesn't have. We need to change that. And so I believe that government funding in Europe will be a really good thing for open source, but we need more people working with the government so that they don't get fooled by the commercial vendors who has more resources in marketing than we have. So we have some government projects with MariaDB, we have some with MySQL. We should have much more because looking at the requirement for some accepted projects in Finland, we could easily have done that. And they paid millions to, we shouldn't name some of the big databases for no reason whatsoever. But yes, and hopefully soon.
Hello. My understanding is that to have a dual license, to be able to change the license in that way, you need to have the copyright of the software as
Yes.
well. How does that work with third-party contributors? If someone else contributes patches and so on, do they have to sign over their copyright and so on?
Okay, so I like to not restrict contributors. I want them to feel that they participate in the project, but they don't lose anything. So during MySQL time and also in MariaDB, we basically allow contribution under two different ways. Basically, they can use under the BSD license because that's compatible with MySQL and MariaDB, and it still doesn't restrict the user from, he can still use the code any way he wants. The other way is that we do a shared copyright, which a person would like, because that says that you're giving a copy of the code to me, which is a different copy than yours. And I have all rights to this one, and you have all rights to this one. And that means that you don't lose anything by giving that. Sun had a similar copyright license. But basically, you need to have enough rights to license so that you can change it as you want, or at least make it a closed source, or whatever your license is, or BSL, so you can change it to GPL or whatever. But so I would say that BSD or shared copyright is the way to go.
Okay, any other questions?
So I have a question. How many of you are expected to be an entrepreneur at some point in your time? One. Okay, so that's about...
That's a lot of hands.
Oh, that's lots of hands. I wish you all the best, and think about the license, because if you want to work in open source, that's the most important thing. There's nothing wrong with doing a service company. That's easier, and you can make a good living for yourself. But if you want to change the world and actually compete with the big guys and even make them bankrupt, you need to have some kind of hook to some part of the customers. Okay.